Okay, well, let me just start by saying that this has been an amazing event, very inspiring and incredible content. Kudos to the organizers for doing this. I've enjoyed it tremendously. And the last part of it now is going to be our second plenary speaker, that is Professor Rajagopal Balakrishnan. So Professor Balakrishnan is a professor at MIT. He's a law and development professor at MIT at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. He's also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. At MIT, he's done a lot of different things, but two important aspects is he's the founder of the Program on Human Rights and Justice, as well as the Displacement Research and Action Network. He's involved in a lot of national and international activities, policy making, and so forth. I will take away a lot of his time if I actually describe his own CV, so I will be short. Written many articles and so forth in the area. But I do want to say that his interest is fairly broad. In areas of conflict, conflict resolution and disputes, mediation, but most importantly, in the areas of housing, land and land use and development and their relationship with each other. We're hoping that some of that experience will appear in the plenary lecture. So please join me to welcome Professor Balakrishnan. Thank you. And he's going to be on Zoom.
Dear participants, colleagues, friends, it is my great pleasure to meet with you virtually in my capacity as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing of the UN. Many thanks for inviting me. I'd like to use this opportunity to have an exchange on the respective work that I have done on housing discrimination and spatial segregation, and briefly touch upon the most recent resolution on adequate housing adopted during the last session of the UN Human Rights Council in response to these reports, which focused on racial discrimination, including on systemic racism in the field of housing. In October last year, I presented to the General Assembly my report on housing discrimination, which is intimately interlinked with my report on spatial segregation that I presented in March this year to the UN Human Rights Council. When the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing was established, states recognized that discrimination in housing was a major barrier and that discrimination based on prohibited grounds such as race, ethnicity, or nationality is often a motive behind forced evictions. This is also reflected in the official title of my mandate, which has an explicit reference to the right to non-discrimination, unique for a global human rights mandate focusing on a particular right. Over the last few years, social mobilization calling for racial justice in the United States of America has pushed forward a long-delayed reckoning with racism and shifted debates globally towards a focus on the systemic nature of racism and the institutions that perpetrate it, as underscored in the recent report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. My reports also build on other important events that have urged prioritizing attention and global action to fighting discrimination and advancing principles of equality, such as the Durban World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. In my reports, I underlined that slavery and colonialism were among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, and that institutionalized and structural discrimination impacting all aspects of human rights of affected groups, not least their right to adequate housing. While the cases of South Africa and the United States of America have been more widely documented, the history of discrimination and segregation in access to land and housing is becoming well known in a large number of countries. Discrimination in housing continues to be one of the most pervasive and persistent barriers to the fulfillment of the right to adequate housing. Housing discrimination is a global problem affecting many groups and all elements of the right to adequate housing. This includes lack of equal and non-discriminatory access to private and public housing, to building, land, or housing for rental. Housing discrimination can as well take the form of unequal or discriminatory access to mortgages and credit, discrimination in relation to habitability and inheritance of housing, unequal security of tenure, or unequal legal protection against evictions. Housing discrimination may as well extend to unequal access to public services such as water and sanitation, energy, public transport, and others. Furthermore, there continues to be a strong correlation between housing discrimination, environmental health, and physical security, access to employment, schooling, and healthcare. In my report on housing discrimination, I underlined that prohibition of discrimination is an immediate obligation of states, not subject to the principle of progressive realization. This prohibition of discrimination extends to all possible grounds, both express grounds mentioned in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but as well in relation to other grounds such as disability, age, marital or family status, sexual orientation or gender identity, health status, place of residence, and economic and social situations such as experiencing homelessness or living in an informal settlement, which can make discrimination often intersectional with race or religion. The prohibition against discrimination, furthermore, binds the state and all its institutions exercising public authority, including agencies at national, regional, and local levels, as well as at all public-private entities that in many countries, for example, manage social housing. It is also horizontally applicable. States' obligations to eliminate discrimination relates as well to ensure that private actors do not discriminate. For example, states should regulate and monitor actors in the private housing sector, including the digital platforms at issue in this event, as they may directly or indirectly deny access to housing or mortgages on the basis of race, ethnicity, marital status, disability, sexual orientation, or other prohibited grounds. My report provides an overview of how public authorities can work towards elimination of housing discrimination through regulation and anti-discrimination legislation, and ensure that victims of housing discrimination have access to justice and remedies through judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. I argue for a mix of administrative, non-judicial, and judicial mechanisms that should be easily accessible to victims of housing discrimination at local, national, or international levels, including ombudspersons, equality bodies, and national human rights institutions. Ultimately, it is also essential that victims of housing discrimination are able to seek justice through the formal judicial system. However, even in countries that have well-established anti-discrimination legislation, courts have not heard many cases relating to housing discrimination. There are several reasons for this dire global reality. Many affected people who are victims of housing discrimination lack resources to access courts and face difficulties to prove that they have actually been victims of discrimination on a prohibited ground. The prospect of retaliation, lengthy, time-consuming processes, and few successful outcomes discourage them from seeking justice through the justice system. Instead of engaging in a court battle, victims choose often to concentrate their efforts to find alternative housing, and housing discrimination continues with impunity. My report on housing discrimination concludes with several recommendations. Let me highlight a few of them. I recommend that states should adopt comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation, review existing housing, tenant, land, building, town planning, zoning, banking, and other related regulations, establish accessible and sufficiently resourced non-judicial mechanisms at various levels to investigate individual and collective complaints, ensure that housing and anti-discrimination legislation provides sufficiently dissuasive fines and sanctions. Finally, that states and other actors should establish sufficient compensation and reparation schemes for victims of discrimination in housing, especially those belonging to historically marginalized groups. Dear participants, let me now turn to the second report on spatial segregation. I believe that the issue of spatial segregation is so pervasive that it merited a dedicated report. Spatial segregation can be understood as the imposed or preferred separation of groups of people in a particular territory along the lines of race, caste, ethnicity, language, religion, disability, income, or other status. Spatial segregation is almost always characterized by economic and social exclusion and inequality in accessing infrastructure, services, and livelihood opportunities. Spatial segregation is thus of major concern to the equal enjoyment of human rights without any discrimination. International human rights law has long affirmed that segregation is a form of discrimination. Under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, states agreed to condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertook to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction. Into Article 3. Article 3 has been authoritatively interpreted to mean that while racial segregation may, in some countries, have been created by deliberate government policies, segregation may also arise as an unintended byproduct of the actions of private persons, including the digital platforms and finance companies at issue here. Spatial segregation goes hand in hand with violation of one or several of the core elements of housing as a human right. But location is a key to understanding spatial segregation. When housing is located in segregated neighborhoods which lack access to basic services, schools and employment opportunities, or in precarious or hazardous areas, core elements of the right to adequate housing are being violated often simultaneously. Laws and regulations that require individuals to live in a particular area, settlement, home, or institution are also prima facie incompatible with the right to liberty of movement and the freedom to choose one's residence as enshrined in Article 12.1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This means that as well that voluntary clustering, when people from a particular group decide to live together in a community, is not per se incompatible with international human rights law, as long as this does not have the purpose or effect of the discriminatory exclusion of members of other groups or unequal and discriminatory living conditions. Such clustering becomes a form of spatial segregation and therefore of concern to me when communities defined by common race, ethnicity, caste, gender, language, religion, disability, income, sexual orientation, or other characteristics become subject to unequal enjoyment of the right to adequate housing or other human rights, whether instituted intentionally or as a consequence of omission by state or private actors to address such segregation. Dear participants, my report identifies several key drivers of segregation. They include land use planning and discriminatory zoning, the erection of physical barriers or separation walls, forced evictions and displacement, segregated location of social and public housing, and policies that directly or indirectly stigmatize or criminalize vulnerable groups. It is my sincere belief that spatial segregation is a structural problem that can be prevented and reduced in conformity with human rights if there is a political will to do so. Human rights law, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the new urban agenda provide a solid international framework for action. I concluded several recommendations. Let me highlight some of them. First, that states should refrain from actively pursuing segregationist policies, especially if they amount to some circumstances, if they amount to the crime of apartheid under international law. Second, I call upon states to undertake rigorous analysis of their laws, regulation, policies, and programs at all levels to ensure that they don't result in or contribute to conditions amounting to spatial segregation. This calls for regular assessments through disaggregated data at a ward and neighborhood level of the spatial distribution of disparate communities and their access to the enjoyment of all human rights, including the right to adequate housing, and make such assessments and data publicly available. Third, territorial and urban planning mechanisms should be reformed to ensure non-discrimination and resident participation in the application of zoning, land use, and other development measures. Finally, a call on states to reduce the spatial segregation of IDPs, refugees, migrants, people experiencing homelessness, or others who live in collective shelters or camp settings through the provision of affordable, individual, and decentralized housing. Dear participants, let me now turn to the main concerns that I have regarding the use of big data, artificial intelligence, and digital platforms in the realm of housing, in the light of the broad concerns I have shared about discrimination and spatial segregation. One of the major areas of concern is the link between financialization of housing in general and the move to digital platforms and big data. There is a structural link between big finance and big data, as can be evidenced by the emergence of companies such as Blackstone. Blackstone, one of the major private equity finance backed groups, through the ownership of entities such as Invitation Homes, emerged as a major, if not the principal owner of low-income house rental housing in the United States, while muscling its way into single-family housing ownership and rentals as well. The owner of that group, Schwartzman, is the main benefactor of major efforts in mainstreaming artificial intelligence, as seen in the new MIT school established in his name. The link between big finance, big tech, and data is at the heart of this commodified frontier of housing. This may be less of an issue if big data analytics did not raise concerns about discrimination and racist bias in housing-related fields, such as client rental screening, credit rating and mortgage applications, pricing software for property transactions, etc. But it does. This discrimination can be both direct, in the sense of sensitive discriminatory attributes related to group membership, or it can be indirect, procedures not explicitly mentioning discriminatory attributes that are facially neutral. Many financial institutions use proxies for algorithmic discrimination, such as zip or postcodes redlining of racially associated neighborhoods. Data is also often collected and used by white and educated people, leaving out racial minorities, such as people of color. Algorithms which underlie and guide big data and digital platforms can perpetuate and even amplify racialized data, despite some hope that machine-made decisions could and should be exempt from human bias. A racist past and present can be captured in data used to make decisions about credit allocation. Both the process and the data input can be infected by racist bias. Algorithms can sometimes hide a willingly racist bias by using proxies for data discrimination, making it hard to prove and make litigation successful. Even when no preferences were expressed by an advertiser about race, sometimes algorithms and machine learning will have such entrenched differences that they can racially target individuals of color. Other algorithms do not consider variables of race. For example, the loan product advisor used at the company Freddie Mac. Yet there is no such thing as colorblind credit score analysis, since retrieved data is often biased. While some argue that race neutrality in data does not work, the use of race-conscious data to correct algorithmic racist bias is very delicate to implement, especially in big data operations where massive amounts of information are handled. Yet one can make the case that the development of big data is urgently needed to correct the racial flaws of existing algorithms in the current credit system. Some algorithms are more than 15 years old and developed with data dating back to the 1990s. These processes are detrimental to people of color because they reward traditional credit, which in the United States is deemed more accessible to white Americans. Another major area of concern has to do with tenant screening software in general in housing market where rentals are a major increasing share of housing, for example, in many European countries, and where major private equity finance companies are muscling their way into ownership of rental housing, as I noted before. Nearly all landlords now use some sort of tenant screening software as a way to find who they consider to be the highest quality tenants. Given the cheap availability of electronic civil and criminal court records across the country, sex offender registries, terrorism watch lists, and housing court records, the barrier to entry is low. Virtually any team with modern technology and basic coding skills could control the housing destiny for countless prospective tenants. Individual companies play by their own rules using internally driven proprietary rules to conduct the background checks and provide a recommendation. Given how error-prone tenant screening reports are, a sizable number of renters face technology-driven housing precarity each year. This status quo disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations. Because Latinos and African Americans are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated at higher rates than whites, members of those groups suffer an unlawful disparate impact if tenant screening software disqualifies them as prospective tenants based on their criminal history. People impacted by the criminal legal system continue to be screened out of housing. Criminal legal databases include information not just about convictions or sentencing, but also about arrests. Certain tenant screening companies may not distinguish arrests from criminal convictions or convictions from 20 years ago from more recent ones. But arrests are merely a suspicion of criminal activity, not a proof of misconduct. There are many other concerns as well that arise from the use of big data and digital platforms that I will simply flag as issues to be monitored. Increasing digitalization and the tracking and detection systems that many countries have infringe the right to privacy and disproportionately affect minorities. The Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights has warned of a digital welfare dystopia in which unfettered data matching is used to expose, survey, and punish welfare beneficiaries, and conditions are imposed on beneficiaries that undermine individual autonomy and choice. In the Netherlands, the system in question provided central and local authorities with broad powers to share and analyze data, including information on employment, housing, education, benefits, and health insurance, as well as other forms of identifiable data. The tool targeted low-income and minority neighborhoods, leading to de facto discrimination based on socioeconomic background. Social media's targeted advertising is another area of major concern. Studies in the United States have shown how Facebook used to allow advertisers to narrow their audience, thus excluding Facebook users with certain ethnic affinities under the demographics category of its ad targeting tool. This targeted advertising could be used to prevent Black people from viewing certain specific housing advertisements, which is prohibited under United States anti-discrimination law. Facebook controls an estimated 22% of the market share for digital advertising in the United States, and its targeted advertising, which is the core of the company's business model, has been shown to be racially exclusionary. These practices are best understood as a form of digital redlining, which is defined as the creation and maintenance of technology practices that further entrench discriminatory practices against already marginalized groups. Facebook uses targeted advertising in the employment context as well, raising similar concerns. Then we have security databases, which raise other concerns. The UK, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, for example, uses a database known as the Gangs Violence Matrix that has been demonstrated to be discriminatory. The result is that 78% of individuals on the matrix are Black, and an additional 9% are from other ethnic minority groups. While the police's own figures show that only 27% of those responsible for serious youth violence are Black. Police officers reportedly make assumptions about individuals based on their race, gender, age, and socioeconomic status, which further reinforces harmful stereotypes. The police also share the matrix with other agencies such as job centers, housing associations, and educational institutions, leading to discrimination against individuals on the basis of their supposed gang affiliation. Depending on the nature of the way this information is shared, this poses an opportunity for possible violation of the right to privacy and may affect housing and employment rights on a discriminatory basis. Dear participants, let me conclude with some few words on the resolution of the UN Human Rights Council adopted after the presentation of my reports. While not all of my suggestions were taken on board, I'm very pleased that the resolution endorsed several key recommendations of my report. The resolution expresses deep concern about the effects of racial discrimination and of systemic racism, including as it relates to structural and institutional racism, on the enjoyment of human rights for all, including the right to adequate housing. It also encourages states to examine the extent and impact of systemic racism on the enjoyment of all human rights for all, including inter alia on the right to adequate housing, and to adopt effective legal policy and institutional measures to address racism beyond the summation of individualized acts that promote housing choice and economic opportunity and achieve diverse, inclusive, integrated, and representative communities. The resolution calls in its operative paragraph 2 upon states to ensure equality and non-discrimination when fulfilling the right to adequate housing, including by considering prohibiting all forms of discrimination, in particular racial discrimination as well as racism, in the context of the right to adequate housing by public and private entities, including public and private housing and credit providers and home value appraisers, and through technology platforms for credit scoring, tenant screening, and mortgage loan applications. The first time that in a UN resolution this has been done. Ensuring that housing and anti-discrimination legislation provides sufficiently dissuasive fines or other dissuasive sanctions for housing discrimination and leads to diverse, inclusive communities. Regularly monitoring and identifying any forms of systemic discrimination, in particular racial discrimination in relation to housing, including spatial segregation, and adopt special positive measures and policies at the local, national, and regional levels to eliminate such discrimination in conformity with international human rights law. Establish accessible and sufficiently resourced non-judicial mechanisms, such as equality bodies, ombudspersons, and national human rights institutions that have the competence to investigate individual and collective complaints of housing discrimination, including systemic forms of housing discrimination and spatial segregation. Overall, this resolution is a very important statement. I now hope that member states, UN agencies, and civil society groups, as well as academic institutions and experts, advocate and work for change reflecting the goals of this resolution. The two recent reports are a reflection of my conscious decision to highlight discrimination and spatial segregation as continuing challenges to the realization of the right to adequate housing, and to make these a priority during my current UN mandate. I have also continued to intervene in actual cases involving discrimination against minorities in countries ranging from the United States, involving the Nooksack Indian case, in the Netherlands, involving a threat to remove or demolish neighborhoods of migrant non-Western minority communities in Rotterdam, in India, involving the demolition of neighborhoods of minority and marginalized communities in Delhi, and the Ngorongoro Reservation Conservation Area case in Tanzania, involving a threat to remove more than 80,000 Maasai indigenous community members. And I will continue addressing these issues through the various mechanisms available to me, including through country visits. For example, my first country visit, which I will undertake in June this year, has been provoked by the discussions that ensued around the communication I addressed to the Netherlands last year. And meanwhile, I'm holding meetings with different stakeholders and pursuing a country visit to Tanzania as a follow-up to my communication on the Ngorongoro case. I look forward to learning more about the research outlined in this event by many of you and to explore potential areas for collaboration in the future. I hope that you will see if there are any areas where you think that my voice could be of assistance to amplify your important work. Thank you very much.